Naming conventions. It's an important part of world building. And as I said, we're going to be talking about world building a lot through this series. Now, the names a character gets initially are like the names your mother gave you. Probably doesn't hold a lot of meaning in the epic scheme of things when you're talking about a storyline. They're just pleasant syllables that we throw together. Sounds good. An example of which, Sadia Ada from my Silver Wings novels. When I picked the name, it meant nothing. There was no... I didn't go and dig out any hidden backstory or anything like that to base the name around. In fact, I rarely do when it comes to picking out character names. I usually just, okay, what sounds kind of decent here? You know, what fits this character, this culture, so forth. But that's not really the character's true name, is it? Sadia Ada doesn't mean anything. Little sister. In the context of the books, in the context of that character, little sister means a lot more. It's what her allies called her. Sarge. Top. We're getting closer to her true name. Her enemies called her Entropy. Now, eventually, maybe in that series, I will find that character's true name. And maybe not. We'll see how it goes. But naming conventions are an important part of world building. They tell you a lot about the cultures involved. Examples in fiction are, of course, Klingons in Star Trek. They have the birds of prey. You know, that's the naming convention for their ships. Although they kind of bounce back and forth between them and the Romulans for that one for some reason. I'm not quite sure why. I really should check out that history sometime. But you get the warrior naming convention that tends to show up in that. And warrior naming conventions show up in a lot of stories. They tend to be fairly obvious, fairly two-dimensional when you do see them, though. Because the truth is that warrior naming conventions are immensely more complicated than just naming something after a scary thing. An example from the real world would be the U.S. military. They have deep, deep cultural naming conventions that have a lot of meaning and informs on how they see themselves. And that's something that you really should be trying to emulate when you're developing these naming conventions in your own stories. Now, what do I mean by that? When the U.S. military started naming attack helicopters, or actually just helicopters in general, they named them after historically meaningful Native Americans, Native American tribes, and so forth. Names that had a link to the actual role of the helicopter. You know, the Apache, the Blackhawk. These names actually tie in to what their Native American counterparts were infamous for. It gives you one idea of the cultural naming convention. Another example in the U.S. military would be the Navy, the aircraft carriers. When they start talking about literally the queens of the fleet, what do they name them after? They name them after presidents. Almost without exception. There are a few exceptions here and there. And the exceptions actually speak even more to the culture of naming that we're talking about. For example, one of the latest aircraft carriers is the Doris Miller. It's no President Doris Miller. There's no congressman, no senator. What was Doris Miller? Doris Miller was a chef. Navy chef. World War II, actually, right at the start of World War II. Specifically, he was a Navy chef in Pearl Harbor. And if you don't know the story, you really should go look it up. It's epic. And it's a name that, on the face of it, doesn't make sense with the convention until you know the story. And then suddenly it snaps that much more of the U.S. military's culture into focus. When we get to pick names, when we get to assign names to things we really, truly understand or think we understand, that's when we reveal things about ourselves, for good and for ill. We use names to project strength. We use them to hide weakness. And that's something that cultures in your novels should probably be doing, because it is a deeply psychological thing, and it will form a greater depth to your story. Another example from the real world would be countries that get to name themselves, particularly in the modern era. The USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. They weren't a union. They might have been Soviet. I'd have to look that up. They sure as hell weren't socialist, and they were not republics. But it shows what they were trying to project. What at the time, the words were positive. Today we look at socialist and we see it as a negative thing. It's gotten a lot of bad baggage, in large part due to the USSR. But at the time, it was a way of saying, we're for the people. Okay? And that was what they were trying to mask. They were trying to hide the fact that they were actually tyrants. They had no intention of being for the people. Or if they did, they had no idea of how to do it. So they had to hide that weakness. Cultural convention. Psychology. Cultural psychology in this case. A more later example would be North Korea. The People's Democratic Republic of North Korea. They're not democratic, they're not a republic, and they sure as hell aren't for the people. They're hiding the inherent tyranny that they knew they were going to project behind democracy, behind a republic. Think about that. Whenever you see names that are chosen or assigned with that kind of forethought, what are they trying to hide? What are they trying to project? And when you come to do your names in your own stories, think about the culture behind that name, the culture behind the ship involved, the culture behind the planet, or whatever. And consider what they're trying to hide with the name. What are they trying to project? Sometimes they're trying to honor something. And in honoring something, they're still trying to project strength or hide weakness. It almost always comes down to one of those two things. Show strength, hide weakness. And on a cultural level, when it comes to naming conventions, it's fascinating how often you can boil a name down to something that simple. And world building, boiling it down to simple things, lets you make far more complex and in-depth things going forward. It's worth thinking about, I think.